Well, thank you again for coming to another lunchtime seminar. What we're going to do is hear today from Ofgem. We're going to talk, Yvonne is going to talk briefly about some work on electric vehicles. If I understand this correctly, you're on knowledge exchange from Newcastle University, coming into Ofgem to transfer knowledge about electric vehicles. So Yvonne's going to talk briefly about that. And then Jeff Hardy is going to take over and talk to us about Ofgem's current thinking with respect to sustainable development. So Jeff is now a senior manager for sustainable development at Ofgem. You might know his name previously from UKirk and the NERN newsletter, but Jeff's also going to talk briefly about his career path, which is quite interesting for you guys in this area to see how careers can develop.
Firstly, thank you for the invitation, Mike, and thank you for the introduction, David, and thank you for hosting me today. It's really nice to be out the office. It's really nice to be kind of like coming along and talking to the research community. As you've heard, I used to work for UCL-Energy Research Centre, so it's nice to be kind of back in a place where I've spent a lot of my career kind of like talking to researchers and kind of like hopefully hearing some really, really interesting questions that I can't answer later. What am I going to talk about today? So the way in which I've structured my presentation, I'm really nosy about other people's careers and how they got to where they're at. So I'm going to basically make you listen to my career and kind of like learn about where I came from. You know, and I'm always happy to exchange thoughts on how I got to where I'm going and whether I planned it. The answer is no. By the way. Mike asked me to talk about Ofgem, so to put Ofgem in context. What is it we do? How do we do it? How do we organise ourselves? How do we take decisions? And then I'm going to talk about my team, which is the Sustainable Energy Policy team, so to understand what we do and why we do it and how we do it. Then I'm going to depart from what I would describe as Ofgem policy. Okay, so this bit on the future is electric. When I go into that bit, it's my opinion. It's related to quite a lot of work I'm doing at Ofgem, but it is not official Ofgem policy. So if you're quoting it, you're quoting me, you're not quoting Ofgem, just to be clear on that, for the record on the camera as well. And at the end, I'm going to present what I think some of the questions are that this electric future raises for the regulator. So it's kind of some big questions that I tangle with. And that might help stimulate a discussion, but please don't feel obliged to try and answer all of those questions. Please come back with your own questions on that. So, me. So this is where I've come from. So, back in 1990, as a 16-year-old leaving school, I took an apprenticeship at BNFL PLC Sellafield. So, I think everyone knows that that's the big nuclear reprocessing site in the UK. I was born and bred in Cumbria. I live in Seascale. My parents live in Seascale, 1 mile away from Sellafield. So it's the place that everyone goes to work. So I left school to go in their scientific apprenticeship, which basically meant I did my A-levels in chemistry, physics and maths as a national diploma, a BTEC national diploma, with vocational training as well. And I spent 4 years at Sellafield up to my armpits in actinides. So basically, I used to really, really love working with the kind of like the nastiest, hottest nuclear materials. So plutonium, neptunium, americium, uranium was pretty boring, but I used to work with that kind of thing. So lots of work in glove boxes, lots of work kind of like doing titrate. If anyone's done titrations at school, you do titrations, it takes about half an hour. 8 hours for a titration in a glove box when you're titrating plutonium nitrate with hydrofluoric acid. So after 4 years at Sellafield, I went to do my degree and PhD in chemistry at York University, and then I got the bug about academic stuff, so I stayed on for 4.5 years as an academic, full teaching load, raising money, writing papers, teaching students, tutorials, endless tutorials, and marking scripts, lots and lots of scripts and exams and so forth. Really enjoyed that time. My specialism was green chemistry, and my particular topic was chemicals and fuels from biomass. So how do you add value to biomass in the same way as you add value to fossil fuels in a petrochemical refinery? That was the basic tenet, so it was the biorefinery stuff. I left York in 2005. I came to London. It was for love. I came down to be with my girlfriend, now wife, now mother of my daughter, in London, and I took up a job at the Royal Society of Chemistry. So that was Energy and Environment Policy Manager. And that was a really interesting remit. So obviously it's an organisation that's lobbying for chemistry, and trying to kind of push the chemical case everywhere we go. But the point of that was, it was really broad. So I'd come down with a green chemistry kind of background, and that was 1 out of 4 of my areas. The other 3 were sustainable water, sustainable energy, and environmental remediation. So climate change was in there, energy was in there, sustainable water was in there. It was really, really interesting to get my head across that stuff. And that's where I met Yvonne. She came to work for me. I told her on my first day I was leaving because I was going off to join the UCL-Energy Research Centre. So RSC, because of the energy policy work I was doing, really gave me the energy bug. And I wanted to get more in depth. It also, at the RSC, I learned that, I don't want to be rude, but academics aren't always the best at explaining their stuff to policymakers. Now, this institute's very good at that, I know that, but not all academics are brilliant at that. So one of the things I wanted to do was to translate more research into policy. Another thing I wanted to do was bring academic communities together to kind of increase the opportunity for collaboration and that kind of thing. So that was the National Energy Research Network, or NERN. So if anyone was a member of that, you'll have been, I'll have inflicted my blogs on you for 4 and a bit years, something like 100,000 words of blogs over that time as part of a newsletter. I left UKirk in 2012 to come to Ofgem, and that was really motivated by I was a bit sick of trying to influence from the outside in, and a bit kind of really wanting to put my money where my mouth was, so I thought I'd take the plunge and try and get stuff done from the inside. How can you kind of help facilitate the sustainable energy transition? What sort of things happen there? An opportunity came up in the sustainable energy policy team at Ofgem, which I jumped at. So I've been there 2.5 years now. I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing in that, but it's been really, really interesting and really hard to get my head around how things actually happen, certainly from a regulatory perspective. And just one thing to note, I've recently also been appointed an honorary fellow at the University of Exeter, so that's in Catherine Mitchell's energy policy group. So that's a very recent thing. I'm not quite sure what we're going to do, but I really want to use it to go and do some teaching with students, and also hopefully do a little bit of research with Catherine's group as well. So that's me. What is Ofgem? So apologies if this is a bit, well, rubbish as a screen grab, but the way in which I like to present what Ofgem does is to show the breakdown of your bill, because that's pretty much everything we do is within the breakdown of this bill. So this from something called our supply market indicators, which is a kind of rolling account of what proportion of things turn up in your bill, and also how much bills are going up or down over time. So the reason why it captures everything we do is because it captures the wholesale market for gas and electricity, so where generators are selling their power, where gas is being brought into the UK, and it represents the retail market where suppliers are purchasing electricity from the wholesale market and selling it to us or industrial consumers or whatever it might be. So there's obviously all of the things that go into that. You have to have a license to be a supplier, you have to have a license to be a generator. Ofgem does that process and kind of writes the license and enforces breach of license. But there's also the monitoring aspect. How are we sure that that market is functioning correctly? How are we sure that consumers are not being ripped off, for want of a better word? Then there's a whole monitoring effort around there. Here is network costs. That's about 23% of the bill, and that's getting the energy from where it comes into the country or from where it's generated to you, through transmission, through distribution to your house. And obviously those network companies are monopoly network companies, so we regulate them under price controls, which means we ask them how much money they need to spend in order to meet their outputs, like reliability, like customer service and so forth. They put a business plan to us that will cover that for the next 8 years, and we say, that's great, do it for less. Generally, that's the way we do it. There's a lot more complexity to that, but we have a big fight about how much they can spend, and then we set it. And that's their allowed revenue, and that's a price control. Lots of other things go in price controls, which I can bore you with the details on, but that's the general gist. There are environmental and social costs, so the cost of the renewables obligation, the cost of feed-in tariffs, the cost of warm home discount, that kind of thing, that features in the bill. It's about 6% of the dual fuel bill at the moment to run these kind of environmental programs, these incentive schemes to get technologies going and deployed in the market. As you might expect going forward, you would probably expect that bit to grow as you deploy more and more low carbon technology, but hopefully the price of those technologies come down, you know, so the kind of like the cost per megawatt will be lower, so the reflection will be lower. But one bit of Ofgem, eServe it's called, administers those schemes on behalf of government. So when I started at Ofgem 2012, eServe was quite a small bit of the building, but because of the growth in the feed-in tariffs, because of the growth in the renewable heat incentive, because of the growth in renewable obligation, that is now the biggest bit of Ofgem. So more than half the people who work at Ofgem work in eServe, and there's about 1,000 people who work in Ofgem. So it's a big bit of the building now. Then of course, there's pre-tax margin profit that suppliers can make. That's the thing that we monitor very closely. And there's VAT. But that gives you an impression about the sort of things that Ofgem does. So network company needs licenses, suppliers need licenses. We do that process. We do price controls for network companies, we monitor the market, we run schemes on behalf of government. And when everything goes wrong, when anything goes wrong, we do enforcement. You know, we look for license breach and then we take action on that. So the way in which we are organised internally reflects the kind of things we do. So I work on what's called Ofgem Orange, which is the policy and regulatory side, and we're arranged to have a networks bit, which is smarter grids and governance. Notice the word smarter. We have a markets bit, which looks after the wholesale and the retail market, and also has a program called Smarter Market, so that word smarter again. Sustainable development, I'll tell you about my team, but the other bits are basically enforcement, so how we enforce any of those other bits of the energy system. A legal team to support that, and also consumer insight and policy. So basically, what do we know about consumers and what does that inform that we should be doing in terms of our regulation, and what sort of research needs do we have. Then across the other side you've got Ofgem eServe. That's the administrative side, running programs on behalf of government. It's all run against, organised against schemes, but there's one bit that's different, which is offshore, and that bit is there to generators cannot own transmission. That's written into rules of generation licenses. So if you have an offshore wind farm, you will, when you build the wind farm, when you commission it, you will commission a link to the shore. You're not allowed to own that, so we basically put that out to another party. We tender it off. People compete to run that transmission asset for over 20 years, you know, in return for a revenue stream. So basically, the offshore transmission is another bit of Ofgem's work. Up at the top, with spectacular diversity, we have our board. So Sarah Harrison is my boss, and everyone on this side is a non-executive director or a NED, and everyone on the other side is an executive director, so employed by Ofgem. And that's the Gas and Electricity Markets Authority. That's our board, so they take decisions, and they're quite important. I'll come into that in a minute, but just hold that kind of like series of grey-haired men and one lady in your head for a bit. So I wanted to mention briefly why there is a sustainable energy policy team in Ofgem. So we have at Ofgem a primary duty, and our principal objective when carrying out our functions is to protect the interest of existing and future electricity and gas consumers. So when our board takes a decision, it is with that principal duty in mind, and only that principal duty in mind, they should be taking the decision. So if they're taking anything superfluous to that into account, they're not doing their job. So it's really important what that principal duty says. And what has happened over the past decade is sustainability has kind of risen in prominence into our principal objective. So in 2004 it was introduced through an Electricity Act that we have to have regard to the need to contribute to the achievement of sustainable development, which is a bit vague and nebulous, I think you'll agree. In 2008, 4 years later, it was promoted to our principal duty. So when you're considering our principal duty, they have to have regard, the board has to have regard to certain things, and one of them is sustainable development. The other thing that was clarified is that Ofgem's principal objective is to protect the interests of current and future consumers. So it's obviously very strongly tied with sustainable development, but it's clarifying that when we're taking decisions, we need to think about your current self and your future self, and what the impacts might be. And then in 2010, we have to now have regard to the reduction of emissions of greenhouse gases and their interest in security of supply. So it's an additional thing to that primary duty. So sustainable development, greenhouse gases, security of supply. All of those things are now in spec for any decision. So we have to have a way of understanding those. So our team, basically within that principal objective, you don't have to read all the words of this because I've read a lot of them out. We have within the principal duty this need to look after sustainability. And when promoting this sustainability, we have this need to be thinking about reduction of greenhouse gas and contribution to the achievement of sustainable development. So as you can see, over the last decade, this has come in and risen in prominence to Ofgem. But Ofgem's an organisation that's quite used to looking at things in a certain way. And I'll give a little case study on what I mean now. So when we have major decisions, we do what's called an impact assessment. And this is an impact assessment of that decision. And typically what we would normally have done is we would have a monetized aggregate cost-benefit analysis. So is this a beneficial thing for consumers? Does it have a big plus number after you tot up everything that this decision will kind of like contribute to or detract from? And if it's a plus number, that's a good thing because it's in the interest of consumers. What are the social and distributional impacts? So who will benefit, who will not benefit? You know, who will be the winners and losers from that? On, you know, where does that fall? Is it falling on particular consumer groups, industry groups, etc.? What my team has introduced to this is the need. So this is in our impact assessment guidance. So what we have to follow when we do an impact assessment.
That differs from the impact assessment guidance for central government departments.
Yes, yeah. That's right. Yeah. So we have a separate and different impact assessment guidance. It's related, but it's not the same. Yeah. And we also have a different sign-off process if we want to explore that later. But what we introduced was something called explicit consideration of strategic and sustainability issues. So these are long-run, hard-to-monetize issues that you might not necessarily be able to take into account fully in a monetized cost-benefit analysis. So these are things like consistency with greenhouse gas targets, consistency with renewable energy targets, optionality. You know, is this decision creating or closing options that may or may not be beneficial for future generations? It's got things like security of supply, effect on price shocks, or kind of black swan type events, and that kind of thing in there. It sort of, yes. There's a bit on learning and supply chain. So basically, is this decision likely to lead to learning that would be beneficial for consumers? Will it be likely to lead to supply chain development, which could be to the benefit of UK consumers? So you can imagine sorts of technologies that might fit into that category, or the sorts of things that might fit in there. So the idea of this is to basically produce more rounded impact assessment that consider more of the kind of like the longer run issues, the uncertainties, the kind of things that you might not pick up if you were doing quite a narrow cost-benefit analysis. And what we're certainly seeing is that we think it's improving consistency of impact assessment, and it's increasing transparency, and it's producing more rounded assessments that take into account all of the issues. It's a bit qualitative, the assessment at the moment, so we haven't done it very often yet in Ofgem, but it's, we think it's getting somewhere. All right, so that's what I wanted to talk about, kind of Ofgem stuff where we're on very firm ground, where we're not going to be detracting, heading off down any rabbit holes of my own making. The next bit is caveated here. It's my opinion, but it does relate to a lot of things I'm doing at Ofgem. But if I say something completely off-piste, it's my fault and blame me, not Ofgem. So that's the general caveat. So I suspect that this is not something unfamiliar to this institution. What we're seeing in a lot of long-run modelling exercises is that there is this new conventional wisdom that says the future is electric. And the general gist goes, in order to decarbonise at least cost, what you need to do is decarbonise the power sector hard and fast, get it done by 2030-ish, and then fuel switch other sectors like heat and mobility to low carbon electricity or something else low carbon. Done. So I know there's tons of caveats around that, and I know that's really horrifically simplifying it, but that is what is being kind of proclaimed generally. Committee on Climate Change, DEC, National Grids, all of them are going down a similar kind of paradigm with different twists within it, but it's a similar kind of like narrative. And when I first turned up at Ofgem, one of the things that I realized was that actually no one had kind of told this story internally. So what I did was I collected a load of data from existing energy models, and the team at UCL was very helpful in giving me data from the Markell model. And I put it into a big spreadsheet and then presented kind of like this kind of narrative with the charts associated with it. You know, so I could show that rapid decarbonisation out to 2050 in the electricity sector is pretty consistent across most pathways, but there are differences of opinion about whether or not you need to go carbon negative. Also, most pathways are showing, or most scenarios are showing, an increasing electricity demand except for some. Don't worry about the scenarios in here. It's kind of like it's a subset for various reasons, but mainly for space. But it's, I think, National Grid reason modelling and ETI on this one, for those who like to know which models we're talking about. But I think you'll probably recognise some of these trends. So okay, that's telling us what we already sort of knew from the narrative, that decarbonise hard and fast, and electricity demand will go up as other sectors start to switch, and economic growth continues and so forth. On the future of heat, what the model outputs start to show us is that gas demand is coming down out to 2050, rarely going to zero, but in some cases it is, and that the demand for electricity and heat is going up typically from the 2020s onward, but really kicking off from 2030-ish when you've got decarbonised power. I have another chart which I haven't presented here, but there's another chart about peak day gas demand. Not all models have that, but what that shows is a different trend in that peak day gas demand stays the same-ish out to 2050, or goes down a bit, but not as dramatically as that. So it's telling me that there's going to be less gas flowing through the grid on average, but on a cold winter's day, that gas grid may be used as much as it ever has been. And that's interesting if you're going to regulate the monopoly companies to deal with that. The other part is the future of transport. Yvonne will take all questions on this. But again, emissions from transport is coming down, but what they're sort of showing to my unexpert eye is that it's coming down later than it is for heat. It's a bit of a sweeping generalization, but that's sort of what the models are telling me. And what it's also telling me is this is vehicle kilometers for electric vehicles. What it's saying is we're not quite sure when electric vehicles are really going to kick off, if they are at all, sort of. So that's kind of like quite an interesting one. If you're planning a network, a distribution network, you know, you have some uncertainty as to when electric vehicles might kick off, and of course there's going to be geographical differences. They may kick off in Newcastle but not happen in Wales, whatever. But so it's kind of reinforcing the narrative, but what it doesn't do when you look at this kind of like, you know, all of this, you can present this compelling evidence, you can talk about the kind of direction of travel that models kind of show as a least cost way of doing it, and you can kind of paint this narrative. But what I've been arguing internally is there's an awful lot of uncertainty about what will actually happen. So obviously scenarios are not predictions, scenarios are not to be trusted for that purpose. They're there to kind of explore what could be required in order to decarbonise and what sort of pathways seem to be compliant with an 80% carbon reduction target. What they don't necessarily do is tell you how you're going to do it. And there's a lot of uncertainty about predicting what's going to happen in terms of building out this electricity system and energy system in the future. So one of the things I think about quite a lot in Ofgem is uncertainty. So this is very crude, and there could be loads of things on here, but basically I'm uncertain about just about everything, give or take, energy-wise. I put some examples here about pathways you could imagine diverting onto in the 2020s if certain things happened, like if there was a high gas price versus a low gas price, you might be on a different pathway. Technology failure, CCS, nuclear, whatever it might be, versus technology success will put you on a different pathway. A strong EU 2030 policy / global policy on carbon versus a weak EU 2030 policy could put you on a different pathway. Weak community action, strong community action, bottom-up energy systems versus centralised energy systems would put you on a different pathway. I could guess maybe some of those things and try and kind of speculate about which ones are more likely to happen, which ones are less likely to happen, but I don't know. So whenever we're taking the decision in Ofgem, the mantra you will hear from me is, how are you taking that uncertainty into account? How are you making sure that your decision is robust in the face of that uncertainty? Because nobody knows what pathway we're going down. We have a lot of trouble predicting what's going to happen in 5 years' time in terms of like capacity and so forth. So we're predicting what's going to happen in 40 years' time is very, very difficult. So thinking about some of those specific uncertainties, technology is obviously one that a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about. I'm sure this is familiar to many of you, but it's the International Energy Agency blue scenario. And what it's basically saying is there are a series of wedges that will take you to a decarbonised world. And these wedges are kind of like comprising either technologies or demand-side action. So I think there's only really two things to take from this slide from my perspective. One is all of that blue stuff, more than 50% of the action, is on the demand side. So whilst everyone gets very het up about technologies and everyone gets very excited about building stuff, over half the action required is on the demand side, which is often seen as far less interesting to some. But, you know, it's all there. The other thing is, in order to deliver on the supply side, there are a limited number of technologies we expect to deploy going forwards. You know, there is room for innovation within all of that, and there may be room for disruptive entry, but actually most of the technologies we expect to decarbonise, particularly the electricity sector, given that it's going to happen over the next decade and a half, are probably well known now. Some of them are not yet demonstrated, but they're all well known. But it kind of like raises the question that all of them have some issue with them. So CCS is yet to be demonstrated, and we've had several false starts in the demonstration scheme in the UK. And if I recall correctly, many of the scenarios coming out through modelling at the moment are favouring CCS coupled with biomass, so to start take negative emissions out of the system. And it's shown quite often that if you take CCS away, it's more expensive to deliver an energy system, a decarbonised energy system, than it is with it present. But we haven't built one yet. You know, we've demonstrated loads of bits of it. I've done a lot of work on CCS in the past, but nobody's actually built a full-scale one in the UK, even though it's a really important part. Nuclear, you know, we think we can get several built in the UK, but if we look to Finland and the delays they're having over there and trying to get just one built, there's no guarantee that it's going to get built when you want it to be built. So there's kind of uncertainty about when it's going to be delivered and exactly at what cost. And then there's renewables, a plethora of interesting issues with renewables, from intermittency to biomass sustainability to how do you operate an energy system with high capex, low opex technology. So how do you do something that can dispatch at virtually zero price and wants to dispatch when it's available? Lots of interesting issues in there. So yeah, like I say, there's two things I take from that. One is there needs to be much more focus on the demand side than probably is in the current discussions. And secondly, we're reliant upon a handful of technologies to get us to the future, but none of them are issue-free. So I'm quite uncertain about what's going to happen if I summarised it even more crudely. One of the other things I'm really interested in at the moment is business models. So if we go forward into this low-carbon future, we expect an energy system to have certain characteristics, certain needs, if you like. So what are the business models that are going to come forward to provide those services to the energy system? Let me explain a bit more what I mean. This is my own artwork. I presented it internally, almost got laughed out of a senior level meeting. But the general gist is, if we think about the electricity system going out, let's say to 2025-ish, we've got our supply side on this side, we've got our demand side on that side, we've got a smartish network in the middle there. It may be very smart, it may be quite smart, I don't know. But what I'm starting to see is intermittency from some of the renewables, an unknown amount of heat network coming in there, providing all sorts of potentially useful services or not to the system. We have much more distribution connected stuff. So we've got electric vehicles, we've got photovoltaics, we've got potentially heat pumps and these heat networks. We've got business customers who are probably about 70% of demand, give or take-ish, who may be wanting to generate their own stuff, electricity or whatnot. And we've got a desire to be smarter about how we do the whole thing. So how we balance needs to be kind of like more, well, we have a choice about whether it's supply-led or demand-led or kind of smart, comprising both. And we have lots of interesting things that could play in there, like storage, like interconnection, like demand-side response. So there's loads of things that could happen. And my question that I have in the back of my head is, who's coming forward to deliver that? What business model is going to come forward and put that to the market? Because if we think about it, even right now, there are kind of multiple challenges facing business in energy. We have what could be described as an existential challenge for the current incumbents, the suppliers, the generators, etc., because we have a decarbonisation agenda, we've had a recession, we have weak balance sheets, we have a lot of stuff that needs to be delivered. We have potential for new technologies to disrupt the markets, all sorts of things, everything from mobile phone apps that you can control your energy with through to all of the range of energy technologies that are going to be deployed. And we have a question about who's going to be delivering that in the future. We have, will it be the current incumbents? Will new players move in? Will Google, will Apple, will Tesco move into this space? Will it be something more local? Is it going to be a complete redesign from the bottom up of the energy system? All of them are fairly open at the moment, but there's certainly other countries going down routes here and kind of giving us some learning on this. And this is just a few examples of things that are currently happening in the market. We have bespoke local tariffs. So Good Energy will offer you a tariff if you live near to one of their wind farms. They'll offer you, a discount on your electricity price and a share of any windfall profits that they make from that wind farm. Sounds a really simple offer. It ran up against retail market review and the number of tariffs you can offer a customer, but they have got a derogation for that now. Or there's local energy markets. These are all sorts of things, everything from small community energy projects through to much bigger things, who are wanting to basically take generation that's local and supply it to people who are local, which sounds like a really straightforward thing to do, but the energy system is quite complex and it's a very complicated place to do that in. But there's lots of people coming forward with propositions about how they would do that. I met with these guys yesterday and they've got a very interesting peer-to-peer site. And they're proposing to be able to do that kind of arrangements and take the complexity away from the customers. The complexity remains in the market, but they can deal with that. And we're also seeing quite a lot of interest in public sector, municipal energy type models. So, Bristol City Council, Nottingham, whoever it might be, saying, well, we've got loads of generation. We've also got big ambitions for heat networks, and we've got tons and tons of demand, like social housing or town halls or that kind of thing. Can't we just do something that brings that all together? And there's all sorts of interesting business models coming forward with that agenda. So we're getting quite a lot of pressure on us from the outside world at the moment for people wanting to do stuff. And to be honest, it doesn't always make sense within the current regulatory framework. So we're looking at all sorts of things about how we would enable it and how do we measure the benefits of doing so, etc. But of course, that's what's happening now. What's going to happen in the future? So I sit on the advisory board of the Realising the Transitions pathway, which is an EPSRC project that's looking at interesting kind of like future energy scenarios with a very strong narrative behind them. And what they're looking at is kind of like 3 different scenarios, one of which is a market-led energy revolution or a market-led decarbonisation agenda, a centrally coordinated, strong central government control of that, or 1,000 flowers, kind of like bottom-up community action, lots and lots of distributed energy. And I find this a very useful kind of framing to start to think about what sort of business models we might start to see coming forward under certain conditions in the future, or what sort of market needs there would be. And that's just a little bit more detail on the 1,000 flowers version, because it has a very interesting, very local kind of model with locally owned networks, local ESCOs, energy service companies, and real kind of like local balancing, all sorts of kind of like things going on. So a very different role for system operation and system balancing under that kind of pathway. And the final point I wanted to make is we're also quite unclear about, or uncertain about, what consumers will want. Will they be active, engaged consumers in this future energy system? Will they be unengaged consumers in this future energy system? And what does that mean for the energy system if they're one or the other? So this is just a total thought exercise, but you know, if we imagine a situation where we're asking the future consumers how they're paying for their energy, will they tell us that they're paying per kilowatt hour like they are today? Will they be on some sort of broadband tariff, so the equivalent of you know, an 8 megabit broadband connection, an 8 kilowatt house connection? So you can use as much as you want within your kind of like monthly allowance, but you can't use any more than 8 kilowatts at a time. Will they be on a mobile phone type tariff? You know, you have agreed to use up to this many units per month, you know, for a fixed cost. Anything you use outside of that is going to be really expensive. You might have a separate bit, like your data thing, that looks after your electric car tariff. I don't know. Will it be an energy service? You know, do we stop paying for it by kilowatt hour, but we just pay for light, heat, cooking, whatever, and therefore the energy service company, their mission in life is to deliver that to you at least cost? You know, so they might be encouraging you to be energy efficient. They might be doing all sorts of things that perhaps the current market is not. Is it you're paying for it as a community? It's very local energy. So, you know, when you have surplus energy and you want to trade that, are you asking for money in return, or are you asking, you know, if Yorkshire's trading with Lancashire, are they asking for a box of cabbages? You know, kind of old school kind of market kind of trading. You know, it's like, I've got a commodity, you've got a thing, we both want the other thing, let's trade it. You know, that's the value of it. Or not at all. So let's say, I don't know, that PV continues to fall in price, or fusion comes to be, and it's just not worth metering it. It's so cheap, it's, you know, not even worth metering it. And let's say we don't need wires. It's like, you know, energy in the air like you can have at the moment. Is it a bit like Google? You know, so you don't pay for Google, but someone, you know, makes money out of it. You know, how would that be if energy was basically free? So lots of interesting thoughts. I don't really get to write papers on this in Ofgem, unfortunately, but it'd be quite nice. So final slides, and this is just some questions to pose to the room, and questions I pose to myself. So a question I've probably mentioned a few times: how do we take energy system uncertainty into account when we take decisions that might be in play for 60 years? What will be the future generation mix, and where and how is it going to connect to the energy system? Is it going to be a big diverse thing kind of reaching out into the sea, or is it going to be very local? What's it going to be? What business models are we likely to see in the future? So who's going to come forward to provide those services that the system needs, that you need as consumers? How will consumers want to engage with energy in the future? Same as today, total engagement, kind of a one-off engagement that means that their demand is flexible, all sorts of things. are there new consumer protection issues coming forward? So who's looking after consumer protection on heat networks? Who's looking after consumer protection for demand-side response? If someone's controlling your fridge, where's your consumer protection in that? What other challenges are there that I can't even think about just now? So those are just a few small questions that we toy around with occasionally in the organisation, but I'm sure there are other things that people will want to talk about. So I'm going to shut up at that point, and thank you for your kind attention in a slightly warm room, and open it up for questions. Thank you.
Will, question.
I've got a question about innovation and business models. Now with the new price control framework, we've got lots of money through network innovation competitions for innovation. As far as I understand it, though, all of that money is going to technical innovation projects rather than business model. There's no specific business model stream. Secondary to that, or related to it, is a question about regulatory innovation, and the extent to which Ofgem is enabled or empowered to play a little bit with different regulatory models at a more geographically distributed scale to try out different types of regulation in combination with business models to see what works.
Okay, so on the innovation question, it's not out of spec for business models to come forward. There are some things that are emerging, but they're maybe not that innovative. But you've got things like new contractual arrangements with big customers to offer demand-side response for particular services. That's a business arrangement that the DNO may not have explored previously, and this is a business arrangement to avoid investment in traditional network capacity. So defer investment. There are also some interesting, more social things coming through. So there's some community energy projects starting to come through, and there's some other there's kind of two tiers of funding, one of which is what the companies basically have the discretion to spend themselves, and one of which they bid for in competition with others. And within that other kind of pot where they have discretion, there are some really interesting small projects looking at all sorts of things, from business models to community engagement to other things. So I think you're right that there isn't that much coming through, but it's not out of spec for it. If I was going to, I would probably suggest that the companies are more focused on the technical stuff because that's their background. But if someone was to propose a really interesting business model thing, it might scare them a bit, but I think they would be more than happy to have a go at it. Regulatory innovation, yes, we are in that space. We are thinking about all sorts of things at the moment. There's probably not that much public pronouncement on bits, but those who know a little bit about Ofgem will have seen some things coming through the Smarter Markets programme, some things coming through some of the networks work, about how we think about license conditions and whether or not certain technical standards are halting things happening. But yeah, if I was to gather, well, I am gathering together a whole register of regulatory issues to new business models coming through at the moment. Where that discussion will go, I don't know yet. But we're certainly we're well aware that there's a lot of things that people are interested in doing that are quite difficult to do at the moment.
My question is about what do you think about the use of decentralized energy supply in the whole kind of plethora? Which one of those technologies do you think will have the biggest impact, and how will it impact the supply from the centralized?
So I'm personally quite taken by the Thousand Flowers scenario, and in that scenario it's about 50-50 distribution transmission connected. So half of it's electricity mainly they're looking at, but half of it is connected locally, and their entire model is around how do you operate the system, how does the system operate when you've got so much local. So it's a much stronger role for distribution network operators, more like distribution system operators, and quite a lot of interesting challenges about who's responsible for doing stuff. But the reason why I'm quite taken by it, it has an awful lot of heat network in there, kind of like renewable driven heat network. And heat networks look really interesting when they're there, because it gives you all sorts of system flexibility options, because they have the potential for heat storage, they have the potential to kind of like optimize for electricity or heat. They have the opportunity to kind of soak up intermittent energy, you know, so that this is how they run it in Denmark. They have basically massive boilers, you know, 60 megawatt boilers, and when the wind is blowing really hard and the prices are zero or negative, they soak it all up in a big heat store tank and then pass that on to their consumers. And I like the kind of like the philosophy of it, in that, you know, it's locally driven, it's co-op or kind of like in consumers' interest run, you know, so it's mainly not-for-profits who are there to kind of like minimize the cost of your bills and that kind of thing. So I see lots of benefits in being in that place, but what I can't say with any certainty is whether we're going to get anywhere near it. So it doesn't feel like the UK's on that pathway in any way, shape or form. It feels like we're very much going down a, if I was going to use the transitions pathway thing, we're basically going somewhere from market rules towards central coordination with the EMR and that kind of thing. So we're actually getting a stronger central control, but within the current market rules framework. So you know, I'm personally taken by the Thousand Flowers. I can see lots of benefits in being there and high consumer engagement and all sorts of things about it, but I don't see that we're taking a step down that path. There's a lot of interest in community energy, I should say, but it's, you know, it's niche at the moment. It's not, you know, we're not going down a German route right now. So, you know, I like that, but we're not going. I think it feels difficult at the moment with the way in which everything's aligned towards that central big stuff, you know, at all levels. You know, big companies are set up to do things. EMR is all about big technology. We have a market that's focused on kind of like very central kind of like balancing and, you know, top-down stuff. So I'm not saying that it couldn't be so compelling because it's demonstrated its worth and it's the thing that everyone wants, you know, that it couldn't change that paradigm. But it feels like, you know, there isn't a lot of momentum behind from a kind of like whole kind of like policy and regulatory framework.
Well, we'll give you an next one, John. Go back to that last slide you had again, 4 questions on it. In some ways I find it kind of, I mean, they're very, very general questions. They're quite astounding when you think that many of the main countries that regulate networks, very high capex, very low opex, and when they build something, it lasts, certainly on the electricity side, 25 years, gas side, probably 50 years. And so investments we're actually making now are actually setting up the energy system on that sort of long-term timescale. And so I kind of wonder how I'm surprised there isn't more of a focus within the organisation of trying to get to the bottom of these questions, or trying to build some strategies that are robust to the uncertainties in order to justify making these investments on an ongoing basis. Like the Iron Major Placement Programme, for example.
Yeah, although that's obviously HSE led. Yeah, I take your point. I think let me argue a bit for the Rio framework. So what we had in the past for network price control was RPI minus X. So basically your revenues are set as kind of like some function of RPI minus an efficiency factor. And it really drives you to kind of like do things in the most cost-effective way or do nothing at all, ideally. That's kind of like where you get your most money from. So what we've transitioned to is a new price control framework. It's a longer price control, it's 8 years. It's called RIO, which means revenue equals incentives plus innovation plus outputs. So it's an output-focused thing. So what we're asking the companies is, we would like you to deliver this reliability, we would like you to deliver this customer service, we would like you to deliver these environmental outputs. You tell us how you're going to do it. Okay, that's the kind of philosophy behind it. And they write a business plan and tell us how much it's going to cost. But within it, there are a few drivers that I think speak to your point. So one is, if you want to replace a cable, Ofgem and the companies know how much that cable costs. You know, and we will argue the toss over that, and then we will agree what it is, and it will cost, you know, 10 quid or whatever. So you'll put into your business plan, I expect to have to replace 100 of those cables, and it's going to cost 1,000 quid over the course of the 8 years. And we say, fine, we agree with you, you can have 9 quid, but never mind, blah, blah, blah. And then we set that revenue, and they say, right, that's what I need to spend. If, when it comes to the time when they need to replace that cable, they can do something innovative that means they don't need to replace it. So if they can do a DSR arrangement, a demand-side response arrangement with a customer, or, you know, something smart that means that cable doesn't need to be replaced, what happens is they say, we didn't need to replace that cable, and we say, that's great. You can still have the money, but you have to share it. You have to share the kind of the surplus with the consumer. So they get to keep 70% of that 10 quid, and the consumer gets 30 quid. You know, so it's in their interest not to do traditional stuff if they can get away with it. You know, if they can work out a way that's going to be more innovative and get them to that point, it's in their interest to do so. And of course, the innovation funding is aligned with opening up those smart opportunities for them to then roll into business as usual. So if you read Ofgem press releases when we take our final decision, assuming, well, on our draft determination, which is the step before we finish finalise the price control, what you'll see is it says we spent X on innovation, and in the business plans the companies have pretty much doubled that in terms of the benefits they expect to realise from that money in the next price control, and it'll be massive if you look out to the next 30 years. So it's the innovation mechanism is starting to fold into business as usual, and business as usual is starting to avoid traditional reinforcement. So I'm not saying we're all the way down that road yet. I think I'd be pulled up on that if I did, but I think there is promising signs, and certainly that's what this price control methodology is trying to do. But price controls are pretty difficult to do because obviously they don't want to tell you really what their costs are. They want to tell you that they're much higher.
So Jeff and Yvonne, of course, thank you very much for coming and for the presentation.